What's up, everybody, and welcome in to another edition of the Sit Down. As always, if you enjoy this show and you like what you're seeing, make sure you hit the like button. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. And if you're new around here or you just haven't done it yet, make sure you hit the subscribe button so you never miss another sit down video. I want to thank all my subscribers. I hope you enjoyed my content. Today, we're going to talk about another Mafia topic and question I get all the time. We've heard about Chicago. We've heard about Philadelphia. We've heard about the five families. What about the other cities? What about the small cities in America? Was there a mafia presence in them? One of the states and areas I get all the time is the area of Seattle, the Emerald City. Was there an actual mafia family in Seattle? The answer and story next on Sit Down Shorts. If you know anything about the Seattle area, it's not exactly an area for mafia hotbed. But the question is, was there actually a mafia family associated with the commission that ran and operated like every other mafia family in America? The short answer is no. There is no evidence that anyone involved in the story I'm about to tell ever had a blood oath. They did not belong to the commission. They were not oversaw by anybody. And the only kind of connections that they had with each other was the fact that the individual we're going to talk about today, Frank Colacurcio, was that he was an Italian and he was in mafia-like businesses. He operated a group of people like a mafia type of family. But to me, the Seattle history of organized crime is more of a Camorra-based organization, one with a boss, the Don. In this case, it would be Frank Colacurcio, and he had loyal subordinates around him, including his son, Frank Jr. Let's talk about Frank Colacurcio Sr. right now. Frank Colacurcio was born June 18th, 1917, in Bellevue, Washington, a suburb of Seattle. He actually had come from a pretty big family and was the oldest of six children. Now, his father, William, actually emigrated over from the boot of Italy in southern Italy, and actually it was said that Frank's father was actually connected to the mafia in Italy. Now, he came over to the United States and they would ultimately settle in the Seattle area. He would run a farm where he farmed produce out. And eventually, Frank and his brother Bill and some of his other siblings would actually form their own trucking company. They would haul produce, and that would lead to bigger and better things for the Colacurcios. Now, as Frank got older, he decided that school was not for him. We know all about that when it comes to organized crime figures. A lot of them do not go to school, and they are from families where it is them eager to get into the workforce. And Frank did that. By 15, he had dropped out of high school, and he went and joined his family in the farming business. Now, interestingly enough, in his early 20s, Frank Colacurcio would first face the law in a little bit different situation. In 1943, Frank Colacurcio would be arrested and charged with having sex with an underage girl. At 25, he was horsing around with a girl 16 years old. Now, back then, laws were different. However, Frank would mention that the sex was consensual. It wouldn't matter, though. Frank Colacurcio went to prison. He would get out a year and a half later. Now, upon his release, his brother Bill Colacurcio was very involved in the machine business. And when I say machine business, I'm talking about in the 50s and late 40s, vending machines, pinball machines, cigarette machines, jukeboxes, everything machine-based was very big. And it was a particularly good racket for cities around the country as far as from an underworld perspective. Frank's younger brother, Bill, was very pronounced in the pinball business. In fact, at one point, he would be called the pinball wizard of Seattle. And Frank Colacurcio got right in. He would use money from his trucking business and start buying up machines all around Seattle, whether it was a cigarette machine, a pinball machine. Frank Colacurcio and his brothers cornered the market. They would set up a company called the Colacurcio Brothers Amusement Company. Their brother Sam would be involved in as well. And what they started to do is corner the market completely. And if you did not, as always, get down or lay down, Frank and his brothers, along with several associates, started sabotaging your business. All around Seattle, machines were getting blown up. Things were starting to go down. Now, The truth of the matter was it was just hardball. But back in the 50s, as we know, this would go on for a lot, and it still happens in cities today. Cities like Seattle were corrupt, and Frank knew that with the right greasing of palms, he could get through anything, and he would avoid law enforcement for a long time. And really into his twilight years, Frank Colacurcio was very well versed in realizing that if you grease the palms of the police and politicians, you could get what you want and you could stay out of prison for long periods of time. Now, by the late 50s, the Senate Commission, including Robert Kennedy, started bringing mobsters in front of the Senate. In fact, in the late 1950s, Frank Colacurcio was accused of threatening bodily harm to people in Seattle that weren't willing to get down and lay down, according to the Seattle Weekly, who did a piece on Frank Colacurcio. He would actually be called to Washington to testify. He would never ultimately testify, but they were starting a bit to close in and start to understand what Frank Colacurcio was up to. And long time down the road, which we'll get into, Frank Colacurcio would ultimately have to deal with some of his behavior when it came to involving himself in political kickbacks. Now, the goal for Frank Colacurcio was to expand operations and eventually take just pinballs and vending machines and bring it into something bigger. And the money always flows up in organized crime. And for Frank Colacurcio, that was no different. He would start buying nightclubs, including this one, and various nightclubs and bars and strip clubs around the Emerald City. And he would first introduce strip clubs to Seattle. He wanted in where the money was. He knew that he could skim the fuck out of adult businesses. And what he could also do, which we'll report on in just a little bit, Frank Colacurcio was also getting strippers involved with things they shouldn't be doing for more money. Now, there was a question of, during all this, was the mob going to go out to Seattle and say, okay, Frank, you're making money out here. We want to be connected to you. You're part of the commission. You're part of what we're doing. There is no known evidence that Seattle was ever connected to the commission. In fact, in 1963, the federal government posted a chart showing all the bosses in America, and there was a city not listed. That was Seattle. For the life of Frank Colacurcio, he was never affiliated at all. He operated independently. Now, I want to make this clear as we get into the life of Frank Colacurcio. There is no known connection between Frank Colacurcio ever taking a blood oath. In fact, no one involved that we talk about today is in the Mafia, okay? The truth of the matter is, the only similarity between Frank Colacurcio and the American Mafia is the fact that they are both Italian and they both are involved in similar businesses. Now, we'll get into the fact that Frank Colacurcio was just not in Seattle, and he would set up a vast criminal network throughout the West and really operated with no oversight. It's that simple. Now, there are rumors that at one point in the 70s and 80s, Frank Colacurcio would meet with the son of Joe Bonanno, Bill Bonanno. Now, nothing ever matriculated from that. And Frank Colacurcio was rumored to have told Bill Bonanno to, quote, get the hell out of Seattle. Frank Colacurcio did what he wanted. He made money, and he had no one oversighting what he did. Now, remember, in the 60s and 70s, there were multiple families on the West Coast that were connected to the commission, particularly through Chicago, most notably places like San Jose, San Francisco, Denver, LA. But Frank Colacurcio was able to find his way through. Back to his life, ultimately in 1971, Frank would finally get jammed up by the federal government. He would get arrested for a bingo operation he was running, an illegal operation, and he would end up going to prison for that violation. Now, that would not be the last time Frank Colacurcio would go to prison. It's that simple. As we get more and more in, Frank Colacurcio starts purchasing more and more spots. There is the fact that in 1965 as well, he would open a place called the Fairlight Room in Seattle. He was grabbing businesses everywhere. He was taking the money that he made from trucking and from pinball machines and all this other stuff, and he was slowly building his empire. And what he would do is he surrounded himself with a couple of people. As we know, and as I'll talk about, his son would get involved. His most trusted associate was an individual called Bobby Payton. He had a small group, but he had people that liked him, that were willing to work for him, and he was generally going to get them a job. It was a huge network. By the 80s, Frank Colacurcio pretty much owned the Seattle Underworld. And in 1981, he would actually go to prison after he was arrested again for skimming off the top, this time a bar called the Brass Tiger. And for Seattle police, for the feds, the goal was to bust Frank Colacurcio. He had by this point established himself as the nightlife king. He knew everybody, everybody knew him. And the goal now for Frank Colacurcio was, we're making money in Seattle. How can we expand this operation? And what he would ultimately do is we would start to see his brothers get jammed up and eventually leave the area and go other places. And what Frank was doing was he was sending them down to Arizona, particularly in Tucson or into New Mexico or Alaska. And he was establishing connections where he could school people on how to open clubs and take stuff off the top. He would get a kickback, and he would pretty much own the West Coast. Now, he didn't own the West Coast, but he had people everywhere, including in the 80s. The New Mexico Crime Commission would put out a report that would list Frank Colacurcio as having a presence in New Mexico. Okay, so he was everywhere. His brothers were everywhere. They were setting up a really vast underworld in the adult entertainment business. Now, interestingly enough, in 1991, Frank Colacurcio would actually really have a big problem. There was an individual that he knew in Alaska that he was setting up out in Alaska called Gilbert Jr. Paoli. He was established out in Arizona or out in Alaska. He was given $200,000 by Colacurcio and his son Frank Jr. and basically told how to open this club up and start skimming. Okay, you start kicking back to us, we get our investment back, and you start giving us a percentage. He was teaching people how to skim. It's that simple. Eventually, Gilbert Jr. Paoli gets jammed up. His club gets raided. He decides, I'm not going to prison for Frank Colacurcio Jr. and Sr. He flips against them. Jr. gets 36 months. Frank Sr. gets 30 months. So what's happening with Frank Colacurcio is he's getting these small little pinches, right? But what the feds can't do and what the government can't do is bring Colacurcio in and end his operations. They're not finding violent crime. They're not finding heavy racketeering. They're not finding evidence of this stuff. So Frank Colacurcio continues to mostly beat the rap and all this stuff. He does a couple short pinches, but he's still making money. His clubs are still around, and he's becoming the king of Seattle organized crime. Now, again, there is no mafia, okay? There is just one individual that rules this group, and there's a couple subordinates underneath him. Now, ultimately, Frank would get out, and the goal of Frank now is to continue to grease the palms of not only the cops, but politicians. And by this point, it was becoming harder and harder to have cop grease connections. Now, there was known evidence that politicians not only enjoyed his clubs, but he would be involved in some pretty salacious rumors that were going around. In 2003, a story would be titled Strippergate on the front of Seattle newspapers. And this would involve the greasing of politicians by Frank Colacurcio. He was sending them money. He was giving them benefits. He was contributing to their campaigns. And this would ultimately end up making him pay a lot of fines due to campaign donations and things of that nature. And there was a funny story that would be reported by an individual called Nick Furfaro. Furfaro was a associate of Colacurcio. He would joke about a story one time that would come out involving a politician in Seattle. According to this guy, one of the politicians was in a club that Frank owned. Now, Frank was known to have all types of women in his clubs. Now, he would have 4 or 5 known transsexuals, according to him, that were in these clubs. They were beautiful, according to him, and he was able to get by because the people wouldn't believe that it was a woman. Now, there was a certain politician in one of the clubs one night, and they would joke for years about the one night when that politician came in and was, quote, making out with a trans dancer. And they would joke about the fact that the man never knew he was kissing another man. And that's the type of thing Frank Colacurcio was known for. He truly could never be busted for what he did. He would joke around about the mafia and that it's just a witch hunt. And that's something that Frank Colacurcio lived by. He was truly an underworld king that really couldn't be brought down. It was just that simple. Ultimately, though, for Frank Colacurcio, he would continue to maintain a stranglehold on the Seattle underworld community. And, as the decades go by, the government gets better and better, and eventually they would start breaking down some things. Around the time in 2003 when the Strippergate stuff came out, it also started to unveil what was truly going on in Frank Colacurcio's strip clubs. And this is where the real seedy stuff comes from. It was estimated, look, if Frank Colacurcio was around today, he'd have been involved in the Me Too thing. He was doing a lot of things he shouldn't be doing. One of his associates, Bobby Payton, would once say he, quote, gets laid every night, even in his late 80s. Frank Colacurcio did what he had to do. He did some things that he should not be doing with strippers. And according to Seattle Vice, a terrific book written by Rick Anderson about the life of Colacurcio and other underworld figures in Seattle, he would detail some accounts from strippers that worked at the clubs that Frank Colacurcio owned. And they would author the fact that most of these clubs, you would, let's say, pay $30 for a lap dance, but for 50, 60, 70, you could get a handy in the back, you could get a blow job, you could even, in some cases, get full on sex. And Frank knew he could skim, but he could also up the prices heavily for those deviants that wanted more. And it was slowly starting to come down for Frank Colacurcio. Ultimately, he and his son, Frank Jr., who was now running operations, were in and out of prison, but the feds could never truly bring the knockout punch to the Colacurcio organization. Now, that was up until 2008. Frank Colacurcio, as well as his son, Frank Jr., their homes would be raided. In 2009, on June 30th, Junior, Senior, and four other associates were jammed up by the federal government on multiple accounts. According to the indictment, that would involve racketeering, prostitution, money laundering, and other illicit activities. Now, what would happen was ultimately, to save the skin of his very old and hurt father, Frank Jr. would plead guilty and would ultimately get a long prison sentence. Now, everyone was fined quite big, and this would ultimately signal the end of the Colacurcio organization in Seattle. To this day, from that day on, all of their operations were shuttered. Most of their strip clubs were closed, and they are now just a distant memory in Kings and Pierce County. Now, interestingly enough, when it comes to Frank Colacurcio Jr., it is unknown what he is up to now. I got to be honest. I would always be fascinated to speak to someone like Frank Jr., who is a free man. I mean, he's moved on. He wasn't in the Mafia. He was just an underworld figure. It'd be interesting to know what he's up to now. You'd wonder if some of the network is still open. Strip club business is always hot. You can go anywhere and open it. Ultimately, for Frank Sr., by 2010, he would just live out the rest of his life in a lakefront home in Washington. It was said that he enjoyed fishing and had a leather recliner he loved. When you're old, you love the recliner. Bobby Payton would indeed, as I said, mention that Frank would still get laid every night, and that his ex-wife would still take care of all the chores around the house. Frank Colacurcio lived a pretty interesting life and ultimately really never went to prison for a long period of time for any of his transgressions. On July 2nd, 2010, Frank Colacurcio would die at the University of Washington from congestive heart failure. I guess we could say that Frank Colacurcio, for the most part, got through it all and never ended up paying for his crimes. Was he in the Mafia? No. Was there a presence in the Emerald City? No. It was really just a sensationalized thing by the media to make it look like just because someone was Italian, they were in the Mafia. Did they do things that were Mafia-like? At times. But Frank Colacurcio was really a strip club owner who really lived in a shady, seedy world. Ultimately, was there a Mafia in Seattle? No. It's just another story in the world of the underground. As always, if you enjoyed my video, make sure you hit the like button. We'll see you next time.